on the clash of civilizations. The mandate of this session is to discuss economics, politics, and society. We couldn't have thought of a broader spectrum to cover in the next half hour or 45 minutes. But I think what is interesting about the combination of these three very important verticals in any country is the fact that we've seen a fair amount of clash between all three over the last couple of years. And I think we don't need to look too far or too back in history to talk about clash of civilizations. We have a running clash between politics and business, politics and society, society and business. And I think at the heart of all of it is the fact that there is a deep sense of distrust, verticals has with the other. A lot of the conflict has manifested itself over the last 3 years, I think. It's been a period of churn where we've seen a huge amount of change. As a journalist, I can say that, there are moments in time when you look and say that these were turning points. I don't know whether we are in a turning point, but this looks like a turning point because I think the last turning point in many senses for India was the Mandal Commission and the whole fight on caste politics. Before that was, the emergency and all the leaders it threw up. And this, over the last 3 years, and I would say from 2010, when we had the first whiff of the Commonwealth Games scam, it dovetailed into a whole series of issues. The CAG went active, the judiciary went active, the government was on a back foot, there was a paralysis of policy making, and business went down the tube. The economy is perhaps seen the worst phase in the 20 years of liberalization. So all of it has come together. I started writing my book, Riding the Wave, in 2010, when India was in a very sweet spot. Most of the businessmen were talking about expansion, about growth, about going into new frontiers and doing great work. And of course, in the 3 years I spent with each one of the men in my book, who are great businessmen and have really good backstories, all I saw was the frustration that was evident because all of them were in court fighting cases. Most of their projects were stuck. And while that was one part of it, the other was the fact that rarely have we seen the kind of job losses that we've seen. The fact that the economy has not gone anywhere started hurting us. And the sad part is in this whole atmosphere of debate and discussion, which we are so good at as a nation, we've got prices spiraling. I think nothing has been done about the prices which have been going up, or the fact that nobody wants to hire people. And I think a lot of that has manifested itself in very strong sentiments. And I think AAP is a manifestation of that. It's a revolt against the corruption. So is this a phase? Is this a passing phase where what will come out of this conflict that we are seeing between politics, economics, and society? Are we in the middle of a revolution? What's going to happen next? Those are the questions I'm going to be asking both the gentlemen over here, and I'd love your views on it. But before I do that, I'm handing it over to Vivek, who's done some really interesting work, not only in his book, Indianomics, but I think also the fact that he's done some great work on trade policy and is a good commentator on what's happening as far as the economy goes.
Thank you, Minnie, and thank you to Kumar. I don't know if Kumar is here, and the festival for having me as part of this. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for sharing part of a Friday long sort of weekend afternoon. As you suggested, Minnie, that the subject matter here is so huge and so broad that given the time we have, the very best one can do is just sort of suggest a few ideas, sort of bat it around and then see what the audience wants to talk about. Now, you suggested that there might be a conflict among what you call these three verticals: economy/business, politics, and society. I'd suggest rather that they're all interrelated in a way that is difficult but important to disentangle. In other words, the functioning of the economy has a crucial impact on the way that politics has evolved in this country in the last 5 or 10 years, and the last couple of months in particular, with the rise of the AAP, which you mentioned. And that feedback works in both directions. The politics affects the economics affects the politics, and they're all tied to a process of societal change, the churning that you described. Now, just to keep some very basic facts in mind, the median age in India is 25, which is an extraordinary fact. That means that half of the people in this country, so a little over 500-600 million people, are under the age of 25. And that means, and looking at this room, I think this room may be a bit younger. So what that means is that about half the people in this country are children of 1991, if I can put it that way. These are young people who did not know the old planning Raj, the license Raj, They are products of economic liberalization. They've lived in a global India, an India connected to the outside world through flows of trade that you talked about, investment, multinational corporations, and aspiration. And that is I think, a very important factor to articulate and bring out, that these young people have, in a sense, tasted, or their parents have tasted the first fruits of a new India, of a globalizing India with increasing economic opportunity, but they've also seen the frustrations, the failed aspirations, the challenges that a still poorly functioning state, poorly functioning legal regulatory framework throws up. And I think that is one of the keys to understanding the current excitement, or whichever side of it you may be on, the rise of the AAP, discontent with establishment political parties, discontent with the establishment in general, concern about corruption, about governance. And, I won't want to, spend too much time on this, but as I suggested recently in a column in Business Standard, we've got to see what's happening in India not as isolated or unique. I mean, we tend to be, and we talked about this before the session started, a little inward looking. I mean, large sort of continental countries, whether it's the US or India, tend to be a little inward looking and insular. But what we've seen in India is not fundamentally that different from what one has seen breaking out around the world in major emerging countries, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Brazil, which both saw large middle-class protest movements last summer, whether it's Ukraine among new democracies in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, whether indeed it's Europe itself. Look what we've seen going on in Greece, Hungary. So what one sees is a process whereby a middle class, a new middle class, that has been heretofore disengaged from politics, perhaps cynical about politics, is now getting energized. People are saying, look, we've had enough with this cozy sort of establishment two-party system where they just swap being in power and where they pay lip service to our needs. What we need now is a thoroughgoing fundamental reform of the system, something coming from the grassroots going up, not a top-down dispensation. In the interest of keeping this flowing, just say one thing about that. All of that is very exciting. And many of us, I think many people in this room, welcomed the emergence of the AAP on the national political scene as just sort of shaking up a moribund kind of political economy we had. But one has seen in the last couple of weeks, even the last couple of days, how terribly wrong things can go when you are an anti-establishment, anti-political politician, a politician who rails against the system. Now all of a sudden you're in power. What do? You can't be in government and pretend that you're the opposition, which seems to be what's happening. So there are a lot of question marks about what the shape of this, some people are calling it the middle class revolution, what's the shape of that? What are the dangers, the downsides? I mean, if one looks through history, and maybe I can save this for later, the story is a very mixed picture. Middle class revolutions sometimes succeed, often they fail. And often they can be co-opted by those very elite forces that they wanted to overturn. And even more disturbingly, middle-class revolutionaries have been very ambivalent about democracy itself. Whether it's in Thailand, for instance, in Latin America, in Chile, whether it's in Turkey, middle-class Democrats can very quickly become middle-class autocrats when things don't quite go their way. So that's something I would just point to as something we want to really follow and trace this now in the next few months going up to the next election.
These are interesting times, Vivek, and I think if you go back a little more in history, the Russian Revolution was a factor of the middle working class taking on cudgels against the food system.
All revolutions,
and that
from the American on.
Yeah, and that turned out to be quite anti-democratic, I mean in the long run. Sandeep, I think what is interesting is the fact that it was a manifestation of the angst against the system, against the corruption, against the nexus between politics and business, about the fat cats who had licked away all the progress. But I think the questions that are being asked now is that what next? It's great to stand up and criticize, but when it comes to governing a complex country like ours, does it need more than just anger and frustration at the corrupt system?
What next? I'm quite optimistic. One, for many reasons, but one, because this session is led by you, a woman, and the majority of the persons in a session on India's future are women, right here. So once women start taking leadership, there is a hope, but not women as just persons, but I mean the psychology and the values, that women represent. The values of compassion, the values of coexistence, the values of give and take. So if these are the values which we need to look at when we look at India's future. What is wrong in India right now? 10 years ago, there were about 180 million people in middle class, what you call middle class. And about 800 million people were outside of the middle class, outside of the consuming classes. They were not poor, but they were outside of the middle consuming classes. Today, 10 years later, we have about 350 million people in the middle class, approximately. But still, you have 800 million people in the periphery because the population went up from 1 billion to 1.2 billion or 1.25 billion. If we continue with a consistent growth rate of 7% GDP on an average, in 2027, roughly 15 years from now, we will have 600 million people in the middle class, but you will still have 800 million people in the periphery because the population of India then will be 1.4 billion. So, while there is a growth of the middle class, while there is a growth of the consuming class, while there is increase in prosperity, the people who are living in periphery are locked up in approximately 800 million. There were 800 million 10 years ago, there are 800 million now, and there will be 800 million 10 years from now. This is the problem. So while you see the growth, while you see the progress, while you see consumption, economy, etc., all the positive indicators that you see these 800 million people who are outside the periphery. And that is creating an imbalance in the country. So what is the outcome? So the outcome is, in 1991, when the liberalization process started, as the new era started, as Vivek said, the number of districts, total number of districts in India are 600. So the number of districts which had Naxalite presence were at that time 60. And today, after 20 years of economic growth, the number of districts where there is Naxalite presence are approximately 200. So exactly in the period you had economic growth, you also have the growth of Naxalism. And of course, Naxalism has many dimensions. We won't go into that. But the point is that your economic and political model of liberalization is not working for everyone. So Vivek said that in 1991 or post-1991, a new generation is born which is taking a free economy for granted, which is exposed to so many opportunities. But also since 1991, a new generation is born in the villages of Jharkhand, in the forest of Chhattisgarh, in eastern Maharashtra, in Orissa, in many parts of the India, who are feeling more and more deprived because for the benefit of those born in the cities, you are taking away the forest, you are taking away the minerals, you are polluting the rivers of those people who are there in the villages. So liberalization for some people, for one generation is an opportunity, for another generation is a threat because you are depriving them of their resources. So how do you come out of this conundrum? When I wrote my book in Marathi, Ekadeshacha Shodh, I looked at about 200 countries in the world. 200, that's the number of countries you find in the UN rolls. And there is one mathematical equation by which all the countries in the world govern. You are all internet savvy, you can go home and go on the web and see whether whatever I'm going to tell you is right or wrong. It's just one mathematical equation. If you get that mathematical equation, everything goes right in the country. If you get that mathematical equation wrong, everything goes wrong. And since I belong to the second India rather than the first India, I can't say it in English, but I'll say it in Hindi. I hope many of you are able to understand Hindi. And that is, this mathematical equation is simply this. Jahan neta bada, wo desh hota hai chota. Jahan neta nagrik saman, wo desh hota hai mahan. And that is the problem in India. That you have created a country where the neta is superior to the citizen. And therefore, what are the kind of aspirations we have promoted in the last 10 years? You have promoted the aspiration that the next step, what next? That's the question you ended up with. You want the next step, the next you want to be a superpower. You want to be a great power. This is nonsense. I think it is idiotic for India to aspire to be a great power. India should aspire to be a great nation. There is a difference between a great power and great nation. Great power is built by the rulers, great nation is built by citizens. I want to live in a country which is built by citizens, not by rulers.
I think this represents two very different sides of the coin, and I must tell you something. I disagree with most of what you've said, which is going to make this discussion.
And so do I. So I would like to respond to some of that.
So can I respond? I must start. I disagree. Okay, so my first point is that agreed that there is a huge difference, and I think a large part of the difference and the two Indias that you talk about, and I think liberalization has become the whipping boy of pretty much everybody who talks, and we're socialists at heart. We hate business, we hate economic, growth, because we think it is very elusive and it is very exclusive. But can I point out one issue which I have a constant debate over? Each person in this room had, I can use a sweeping generalization because I think that would be largely true, has had nothing but an education and an opportunity. And we've all come up. Now, isn't the biggest failing of India not liberalization, but the fact that it hasn't reached everybody, that we haven't had factories that have employed people, and that liberalization has been led by a very, very small sliver of the services sector, which willy-nilly helped the educated, because we didn't create the factories. And I think that is the biggest failing of the political class, because in no other country have we had so many policies to try and get people out of poverty, to get people more included, because I think Mandal is one thing I referred to. The 90s saw the Mandal revolution. No country has the quotas that we do, and no country has that, but all of that has amounted to nothing but lip service. It has actually weakened the weaker sections that want to make the change and want to have freedom of opportunity. And I think that is the heart of the problem. 2011, Vivek, I must say, we had the manufacturing policy. All of us said it was one of the big things that could have happened. We need factories. We import everything that we use, including the mobile phones that we have. We don't have jobs. We need those. And that's the only way Naxalism is going to go, or any of the issues are going to go. It's not about mining rights or forest rights. It's about sane policy making.
Some of you may well have, the audience may well be on your side in this, but it's a little precious, I have to say, for those of us in this room in a lovely air-conditioned auditorium to talk about the plight of those who have been left out. As Minnie suggests, the problem is not that they are victims of liberalization. We've had an imperfect and an incomplete economic liberalization, which has excluded most Indians, because, as you suggested, we've had a very peculiar set of policies which have favored capital-intensive production techniques, extractive techniques. We don't have, and this is a paradox of India, a country with so many young people wanting to work. We don't have a large-scale labor-intensive manufacturing sector for a variety of reasons. Now, what does that mean? First of all, this notion that India can somehow leapfrog, we can be different. We can, off the back of high tech, of a few jobs in Bangalore and in Hyderabad, can become a rich nation, is an absolutely dangerous delusion. If you look through history, starting with Britain's Industrial Revolution, looking through Germany, through US, Europe, East Asia, China, and so on, Japan, no one has been able to do that. Whether we like it or not, whether they're glamorous or not, low-tech, labor-intensive manufacturing is a path we're going to have to take sooner rather than later, because we've got to absorb hundreds of millions of young people into the workforce, and that cannot be done on the strength of a few lovely high-tech campuses in places like Bangalore, Pune, Hyderabad, and so on. So we've got to look at the policy failures of the last, really, starting from 1991, and which has really gotten amplified in the last couple of years. Now, you say 800 million people were poor before, and they're poor now. That's a very strange way of looking at it, when the fact is the poverty ratio has been coming down, however you measure it. Any kind of sensible measurement, sure, if you use an American poverty metric, then we're all poor. 99.9% of Indians are poor, according to a European Western norm, and that's a totally absurd comparison. By any sensible yardstick, poverty has come down, and that can be directly attributed to the pulling up of people through opportunities created by economic growth that has empowered people. So what we need, and now I just want to say a last thing, where I strongly disagree with you, this idea that we shouldn't aspire to be a great power. Should we aspire to be a weak country on the global stage? Look at the humiliation we faced in this recent Cobra Gadi affair. Absolute national humiliation. Why? Because we had thought, now the Americans like us, we've arrived, and we got a slap on our face. Why? Because now the last couple of years the economy is in the tank, and the U.S. has other countries that they're trying to court. So that was, I think, a real wake-up call. Whichever side of that issue, and it's very emotive and so on, you stand on, it's very clear that we're losing clout in the world. Our aspiration is to sit in the Security Council and so on. Yes, maybe it's premature, but we've got to have the right aspirations. Are we going to aspire to remain poor and remain on the periphery of global institutions set up by rich Europeans and Americans in 1945? Or do we want to break into that and reshape the global polity and the global society? I think that's what we want to do. Let's not aspire to remain poor, weak, and backward.
Now you had barrage of criticism.
Yes, no, I'll start with the last point you made. An alternative to being a great power is to be a great nation. That's what I said right at that time. I didn't say that the alternative to be a great power is to be weak, poor, and backward.
That's a cliche.
No, of course that's not a cliche. Okay.
Maybe both.
I will explain with just couple of indicators. There are 6,30,000 villages in India, out of which 5 lakh villages do not have schools above 7th standard. Is that our definition of being a great power? That you have a place in the Security Council and 5 lakh out of 6,30,000 villages do not have schools above 7th standard, whatever they may be called, secondary school or whatever they are called. Okay, and like this I can give you a number of indicators. You have to be a great nation. First of all, you address what is most essential. Secondly, a great nation is built by citizens. So you need a country which is built by citizens. How even a small country like Sweden or Switzerland can have a place in the global power structure? Because these are the countries which are built by citizens. These are not the countries which are just built by the bureaucracies. And great powers are essentially countries which are only built by the bureaucracies.
The bureaucracy and the politicians, Sandeep, come from the same firm that we all come from, right? Most of the politicians are very proud of saying that they represent the backward classes of India. They're very proud to be tribal leaders. Political parties are very proud to give, and after decades of this upward move, you're still saying that we are not run by citizens?
We are not run by citizens, no. We are...
Who are these people?
No, these are representatives of people.
They're representatives?
Yes, they are representatives of people, but they are not, our systems are not as participatory as you see in any developed country.
That's because of lack of education, because we still think our politicians are feudal lords.
You have 5 lakh villages. You have 5 lakh villages which don't even have secondary school. What kind of a society you are talking about?
Can I just quickly respond?
You have half the population, half the children population below 5 years of age is malnourished. About 43% is malnourished. What kind of achievements are you talking about? Shouldn't we be addressing these problems? That is what. Secondly, another question you raised about liberalization. Let me answer that. Okay, then you can have your say, Vivek. The question is what kind of liberalization? That is what, I'm not saying that all kinds of liberalization is bad. I'm saying what kind of liberalization. In fact, a lot of the liberalization that you require is simply not done. And we should give a priority to that liberalization. For example, anybody who has anything to do with agriculture will tell you there is something called APMC Act. Yes, this APMC Act does not allow a farmer to sell his produce to anybody whom he wants to sell or wherever he gets the best price. So somebody here selling software services can sell them to the buyer in the United States, but a farmer cannot sell his produce to anyone except for a licensed agent. We are not talking about liberalization of APMC Act. That's the kind of liberalization you require.
No, on that I strongly agree with you, by the way, just so we have a note of agreement. I totally agree.
No,
so this is the unfinished agenda.
The liberalization, the kind of liberalization that we have followed so far is very narrow,
Sandeep, one of the points that you made is liberalization has not been complete. You've had one arm,
yes,
and you have had entrepreneurs cash in on one arm that was opened up.
Right.
You have a large edifice which is not, and that's what we're seeing the clash around. And you know, to your point, and I think that is the biggest dichotomy India faces.
No,
on one hand,
I
must have this one point raised. I've been doing a lot of work with the pharma companies lately. And India is a pill factory to the world. We've redefined the price of drugs the world over. You've done a lot of work in Africa. Companies like Cipla have created the lowest cost medicines for critical illnesses like AIDS, okay? And 90% of critical care medicines come from India. And yet we have malnourished children. And that is the irony of India, that we have the ability, but we've not found a conduit to make sure that every Indian is part of that growth, benefits from that.
I think you're absolutely right that we've had a very partial and incomplete liberalization. The kinds of things you've talked about and I've talked about have not been on the agenda for a variety of political economy reasons. So in a sense, I mean, you and I are agreeing that we've had a very sort of peculiarly distorted structure of our economy that's emerged. Now, what we had before was even worse, according to, to most economists, including me. So I'm not saying we should obviously go back to that. But we've got to push forward on a number of agenda items, the one that you raised, the ones that I raised, and many of others have talked about. Just a second point on this question of that great nations are built by citizens. Now, whether we like it or not, we in this country chose, in the wisdom of our founders, a Westminster parliamentary system. And as many alluded to, our MPs, our MLAs have been elected by the people. And India has high turnout ratios. So in many ways, Indian democracy is more representative and not less than that of comparable Western countries. Now, there are those who don't like our system, who want some kind of direct democracy, which some people in the AAP seem to like, a kind of mob rule where you just show up in the town square and there's some helpless African women and you harass them. That's one kind of way of running a country. Or there's a country based on rule of law, on a parliamentary system which our founders very carefully thought about. Should we have a presidential system? What kind of a system do we want? And for good or ill, and I think from my point of view, pretty much for the good, our Westminster system has served us well. And it has, if we don't like the politicians that we elect, that's our fault as voters. And we've got to go out there and get a new, and that's the good side of the arm. That it's reacting to an aspiration of dissatisfaction, unease with the establishment political parties. And the voters will now judge in the next couple of months how things play out in Delhi. Will they want to entrust this bunch of people at the center? I mean, I think probably people are feeling a little disillusioned with them. Certainly those of us following it are feeling a little disillusioned with them.
I think the other point is we make heroes very fast, we expect too much and we have no patience as a country. So we're very quick to write off people. And I think a bit of that is also happening. But I'm going to veer this discussion away from this very, very contentious issue because I'm sure the audience members will also have a lot of interesting questions on that. But a large part of this discussion was to see where we are in time and place and history and what you make of this churn that is happening. We've had a very troubled 3 years, Sandeep, and I think AAP is a manifestation of that collective angst. We saw that, as I mentioned, during Mandal, before that during the emergency, before that during the freedom, and this creates a platform for a new generation of leaders to come up. But it's from my standpoint, it still seems a little half-baked right now because you've had the party come to power, but they don't have the policies. And I think the stakes are too high not to have a thought-out policy as you come to positions of responsibility. So where do you see ourselves in this? I mean, is the churn going to take longer to settle before we get some kind of semblance?
I think we have been in churning for many years, not for 3 years. Okay.
So in the context of political economy and society, I mean the 3 years, 4 years, because that's been very stark.
In the context of political economy and society, we have been in churning for many years. You have got new political formations coming up all the time. You had, and they have been of different types. I mean, in the 70s, you had the established political parties coming together and forming the Janata Party. You have had provincial-based parties coming up. Yeah. You have got religion-based parties coming up. You have got linguistic parties coming up. You have now essentially an urban-based party coming up. So new political formations have been coming up all the time. There have been also political formations coming up outside of the electoral political system. I mean, this Anna Hazare agitation separate from AAP. That's also kind of a political formation. So you have different kinds of political formations coming up all the time. So long as you have substantial divisions in the society, some of which are endemic to the Indian society, which are cultural, social, religious, etc. And some of which are changing, which are economic and social. But so long as they are there, new political formations will keep coming up.
Vivek, I'm going to ask you a question, a follow-up on that.
So new political formations will keep coming up all the time. Yeah.
Just a direct follow-up to that, Sandeep. That what's a little, I absolutely agree with you. We've been churning for centuries and millennia, obviously. But what's a little different in the last couple of years, last couple of months, is the possible emergence of an energized urban middle class who are very much the children of 1991. And that is what's different. Now, whatever one may think of the AAP and what's been going on, it does represent a turn towards an urban-based political party that is based upon issues, not upon identity that you vote for me because I'm like you, or you're like me, but you vote for me because I'll deliver better governance, reduce corruption, I'll cut your power bills, water bills, and so on. Now, we can argue about the policies, which I think have been half-baked, as you said, Minnie, but that is interesting and that's different. Now, maybe not this election, but certainly in the next general election, whenever that is, the urban middle class, which have historically been rather disengaged from our political economy. I mean, the stylized version of Indian political economy is that the money is in the cities, but the votes are in the countryside. You extract rent in Mumbai, and you go and spread it around the rest of Maharashtra, and that's where your vote banks are. So that is starting to change, and this statistic that's always bandied about that India is still 60 or 70% rural is rather misleading, because many of these so-called rural areas, and you just drive out, you know this as much as I do, that many of these are semi-urban areas. From Mumbai out to the countryside, to Delhi out to UP and Haryana.
I agree with you. So there is no rural-urban. In fact, it's all a huge clutch of towns and semi-rural. Okay, yeah. But I'm going to ask you a question as an economist, and this is a more left-brain question. Okay, so you've got this party which is a product of the middle class angst, which is coming. It's educated middle class coming and demanding their time in the sun in policy making, etc. But the policies that have been announced are very old and last generation, because what we have are soft. So the three big pillars for this AAP party coming into Delhi were, I think, water, power, and I think inflation. The fact, food prices. Now, I've been tracking inflation since 2007 when arhar ka dal went up 100 rupees a kg, and since then I've been tracking it. And what I find hugely frustrating is that nobody talks about the reason for the inflation. Of course, there's the El Nino and all the global churn, but the fact is 40 to 60% of food that gets out of the farm, and by the time it gets to the marketplace, it rots. Nobody has actually thought of what we can do in the back end. Now, you would think that an educated bunch of people who have so much at stake would come and talk about these issues. I've not heard the debate on that. Why is that? Is it because the media is not covering it? Is it because, this is all taken for granted that this is going to eventually happen? Because cutting tariffs by 30% for power at a time when leakages in power are huge and the combined losses of state electricity boards are anywhere between 70,000 to 80,000 crores, which means that in our lifetime they're not going to get into the black, which is a scary thought. So how do you make sense of it as an economy?
You raise a very interesting question, and I have to say it is puzzling for the very fact that the way that you framed it. You have a group of pretty smart, educated, middle-class urban people who got together, and yet the policies that they put forward are harking back to the old days. I mean, as you say, it's throwing out SOPs. It's out, as I wrote in a piece, they're trying to out-Congress the Congress in terms of the amount of redistribution that they do. I think partly a function of the fact that, as you also said, they've come into power without a well-conceived policy platform, and they're being buffeted by a lot of pressures. And being a party that arose from this Anna Hazare sort of Lokpal activism, they have a lot of grassroots activists who are on the left in terms of economics, and a lot of people who one might have thought would be joining this party and sort of centering them in terms of sensible economics. I mean, Meera Sanyal, I think, has joined the AAP, and obviously I'm sure that the kind of economics, she was a former chairperson of Royal Bank of Scotland in India, is quite different. I know her, we all know her from the kind of policies that are coming out of Delhi. So I think the disappointing it has been, let's give them a little time to get their act together if they still have enough time, and see what kind of manifesto they put forward for the general election, and scrutinize. I think what one has to, they've got a bit of a free pass in the media, I've got to say. I've also written on this, that we scrutinize Modi, we scrutinize the Congress, but because of the euphoria that suddenly we have this non-Congress, non-Modi-led BJP alternative, we've kind of looked the other way and not scrutinized their policies closely enough. And now is the time to start asking them tough questions, and then they're going to have to answer these questions and come up with some kind of a coherent economic plan. That how are you going to promise all this, or you give all this stuff you promise?
Who's going to pay
Who
for
is
this?
going to pay for it? Where are the jobs going to come from?
I'm going to ask Sandeep a trick question, okay? And after that, I'm going to, yes, I'm going to involve everybody because I'm sure everybody's dying to ask questions. Now, the one thing that I find very, ironical about India, and we were talking about this outside, is that one arm of India is doing phenomenally well, okay? We have companies, and I have profiled industrialists from Pune, Baba Kalyani, whose small factory at Mundwa produces parts for the biggest automobile giants in the world. And he did it not just during liberalization, but he did it even before the Indian economy opened up. And he's proven all the old myths that India can't produce great stuff, we are low quality, we are, don't think global, that globalization is not a good thing. He's proven all of that wrong. Okay, and he's created jobs and wealth for hundreds of youngsters who've come in over there. So that's one side of the coin, because I think corporate India, for all the distrust that we have for business, has also shown that we've got world-class managers who run banks. I think Citibank globally is run by Indians. Most country heads are Indians. Most of your foreign universities have Indian faculty, and the deans and the think tanks are all Indians. One part of India has done all of that. The other part of India, which has completely been out of the race. Is there something to learn from corporations, Sandeep, where meritocracy, opportunity and hard work pay, and it's not about free lunches, it's not about using crutches, it's about really letting a person achieve what he is capable of. What can we do to create that in a larger scale of things, be it politics or society?
I think Baba Kalyani and the automotive sector, they have done an excellent job, no question about it.
Many sectors.
No, particularly automotive sector. But the biggest scientific achievements in India have been three in recent years. Okay, scientific and technological achievement. One is that we have sent this Mangalyaan, this spacecraft which is going towards the orbit of Mars. The second is India is building the world's largest neutrino laboratory, which will facilitate research in fundamental physics. And this is being constructed at Madurai. Third, and I'm taking different areas. So one is space, one is fundamental physics, one is biosciences. Asia's most sophisticated biosafety lab, what they call biosafety 4-level lab, it was recently set up in Pune. All of that has come in the government sector. All of that has come in the government sector.
Sandeep, please,
all these three have come
every
in the government
Fortune
sector.
500 company
But let me
has
answer your
back-end
question.
and R&D services in India. Chennai, Bangalore and...
But you want me to answer your question?
I don't think it's not either or. I don't agree with that. Do you agree with that?
No, I'm not saying either or, but let me complete.
It's not just the government.
No. You give some examples from private sector, I'm giving you some examples from the government sector. Just because I give examples from government sector doesn't mean I'm negating private sector. Why are you assuming I'm negating private sector? Because you are assuming, you are just making a hypothesis. This is the problem with people from private sector. They think they know all, and government doesn't know anything at all. This is the problem of attitude of the corporate sector and the hypothesis of corporate sectors like you. That is the problem. That just because some good things are happening in private sector, I acknowledge them to begin with, but you don't deny what is happening in the government sector. The bottom line is this. This is a country of 25 billion people. In this country, there are people from government who are doing good job. There are people from private sector who are doing good job. There are people from industry who are doing good job. There are people from agriculture who are doing good job. India is the #1 exporter in the world of rice. India is the #2 exporter in the whole world of wheat. Now, when you think of examples, you only think of the examples of entrepreneurs and industrialists, which is good. I'm proud of these industrialists and many of them are my friends. But I'm also proud of my farmers. I'm also proud of my scientists in the Bay RC. No, but you are presenting it because I never said a word about against liberalization. and it's not you as a person. I'm just saying that all apologies from corporate sector don't think that nothing good happens in the government at all.
I must stand up for what you're saying.
Yeah.
I did not mean that.
Yeah.
You told me that the three most important developments
Of course, these are
all
the-
happened in the public sector.
These are the three most significant development in science worldwide. These are not just three most
I'm not
significant
gonna argue with you, but I think
No,
everybody
you
who-
tell me what is more significant that has happened in India is that than the biosafety level 4
I think my
lab.
question
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
how can we replicate successes and learn from the successes wherever there is?
No, but
No, Sandeep, you've spoken quite a lot, so I think you should let someone
Okay,
else
no,
speak.
I listen to you, yeah.
And I'm not getting into this, and I don't think Vinny said that. There are examples of great innovation in the public sector and the corporate sector.
Yes, exactly.
And that's not the argument. I think your question really was, how do we get this meritocratic culture? And the answer to, no one has a simple answer, but we've got to move beyond the culture of cronyism that we all know, whether it is in the corporate world or the public sector, where you hire someone because they're your cousin or your friend. You've got to, and we've got to, there's too many, strands to this. We've got to get to a culture of meritocracy rather than cronyism. We've got to reform our education system, which is still based on this old model of rote learning. We've got to inculcate creative thinking among our young people, and that means more liberal arts. It means questioning your professors and your teachers. As you suggest also, Indians, when they go abroad, when they're given the freedom to express themselves, to be creative, to thrive, whether it's in Silicon Valley or the university system, wherever it is, they rise to the very top. You go to Silicon Valley, you go to university campuses, you've got Indians and Chinese. There are a few East Europeans, a few Latin Americans, of course there are a few old stock Anglo-Saxon Americans. So that's the key. How do you create that culture where you're rewarded for having an interesting idea, not sort of slapped down saying, you're breaking the hierarchy. And that has to come across the board, whether it's government or the corporate.
And I think this argument was a reflection of the very strong mental blocks that we all have when it comes to this, because I think everything gets shouted out, but I think at one level we need to look at it more logically. And I think where we have seen success, and it's not either or, it's not like, I think the last year debate on whether we should have more bathrooms or we should have more jobs was, I think, the most ridiculous debate I've ever heard. And it was really so ridiculous, because can you have either or? Can you say no to lose and no to educational institutions? That was the most ludicrous one. And I think, I think this is just a reflection of it. It's not either or. I'm going to open it up before we continue to debate this in circles. I want to open it up to the audience to have some questions asked over there.
What is the hurry that we're in? We're a very young democracy, and if you look at growth of the larger democracies in the world, they've been free and independent to make their own decisions for a much longer time.
Sure.
Why is it that we have such a small attention span of saying it's 2 weeks or 2 months since someone's come in power and they failed, so they're going to fail forever?
That's a great point.
Yeah, so.
My name is Dr. Nitin Parab. Of late, we see across our channels that we are gripped with what is known as shallow intellectualism, where a topic which is true, dear, and righteous is kept aside and we move ahead in different directions. How do we, as authors or thinkers, bring the focus what India is, was, and what the future generations should see it in their eyes? What is the dream of the future that we can portray in their eyes? Can we have some thoughts on that?
During the panel discussion, there were a few, metrics and statistics thrown up, like the APMC and the 7th standard, 5 lakh villages having 7th standard. I would like you all to connect to more such, statistics and metrics, because that is the question, or that is the discourse that is not being done. I think Vinny also agreed that, of course, a large part of that discourse is missing somewhere. We are talking of, our liberalization, which of course I am not against. We are talking of the growth of our IT services. We are talking of many other sectors that have seen. A very good point is how we have created cheap drugs and supplied to Africa. There are those positives. But so many of these metrics, in fact, that APMC, imagine a person, he toils, he grows the produce, but he's told to whom he can sell. Because of course, Matadi workers and middlemen have to earn. So I would like you to take that also and bring that to discussion.
That's a wonderful point, and maybe we can start answering the questions from the last one. I think APMC is perhaps the most political and most old policies which have not changed because it's the local politicians who control
I
it.
think we all would probably agree on that, but I wanted to respond to the first two, if I may, and then perhaps Sandeep. I mean, why are we in such a hurry? You know, we can't forget that, and yes, we are in a hurry, and we've got to be patient, and yes, you've got to give someone a chance. But while we're in a hurry, we were colonized for 200 years, and we stagnated. We were India and China in the middle of the 18th century were the two largest, most powerful economies in the world. And by the beginning of the 20th, we had become totally insignificant in the global economy. So 200 years of colonization put us back. So I think while we have to be patient with our politicians and our political class, I don't think it's wrong for us to be impatient. We do want to get our act together and get ahead. Whatever our definition of getting ahead, it isn't just GDP, there are many other things that are important. But I think the impatience is understandable, that we cannot be complacent, and we've got to get on with things. So that'd be my answer to that question. And the gentleman who asked about why are we stuck at a level of shallow intellectualism, that's a very good question. And I think it goes back, in my judgment, to what I suggested earlier, which is we need to thoroughly remake our whole education system. We have a system of education based upon rote learning, technical education based on, without offending anyone, an engineering mentality, where someone gives you a problem and you are you have to find the most efficient solution to it. But how about you come up with your own problem? And that requires a basic level of creativity and thinking, which is fostered through liberal, what used to be called classical education, it's now called liberal education, liberal arts, and that is what is going to open up, young minds and get them not just to repeat cliches and catchphrases and succumb to what you've rightly called shallow intellectualism, but probe deeper. So reading our ancient classics, learning about history, politics, society, the world at large, this is all vital that our young people absorb that, and not just focus narrowly on a few technical subjects because that's what they think will get them a good job.
I think also, with aspirations out there, I think you've shown people a dream. You can't ask them to wait for day after, You have to be able, you have unleashed it. And I think a lot of the angst that we are seeing is also because of the frustration of wanting something. In the socialist Raj, in the license permit Raj, everybody was equal. Everybody had a Fiat or an ambassador. You didn't aspire for anything more, right? You can't open the tap of aspiration and then ask them to hold back. And I think the media, has a lot of blame to take for what we are doing. And I think that's also because when we chase numbers, you're also talking about the lowest common denominator, and it becomes a factory production. But I think we all need to introspect. Two questions that were here. One, are we keeping the weak, and what can we do to get the weak out? And on the fact that a lot of the good data points, do we have platforms that talk about this, where people can access this information?
Well, on the first question the gentleman here asked, I said right in the beginning when I quoted that Hindi mathematical equation, that is the problem with this country, that we have created a society where a leader is superior and the citizen is inferior. And I'm just putting it in a very simplistic form, of course. But and by leader, I don't mean just a political leader, but leader in many ways. You go to a slum, and the slumlord there, he's also leader. So basically, there are serious problems with the way we have evolved as a society and our polity, which is also reflected in the economy. A problem which is there among the thinking or articulate classes is that we have become too much of a computer and TV generation. What I mean by that is we look at the screen of the computer, we look at the screen of the TV, and we form our view based on what we see on the screen. And we form our view what we see on the screen of the computer. But we forget that there is a big world outside of that screen. And so basically, we are reacting. We are losing the perspective. That is the problem. We are just looking at what seems to be apparent. We are not trying to see what is beneath the surface. So we are losing the perspective. We are one of the few countries among the developed countries or fast developing countries where there is not much debate on philosophy, on the social philosophy. We have a lot of debate on the pursuit of the individual philosophy, which is called spirituality. In China today, the person who is treated as a rock star is a guy called Zhao Ziyang, who is a professor of philosophy in Beijing University. I mean, you may agree or disagree with his philosophical thought, but the point is that philosophy is extremely debated in China. Here we say liberalization, and your concept of liberalization is what you see on the screen. So the cooperative sector, a lot of people here may not be aware, is extremely regimented. So if there is a cooperative of a particular crop in a particular district, and if the cooperative dadas are exploiting the farmers, and if the farmers get fed up and they want to set up a parallel cooperative, they are not allowed to set up a parallel cooperative. There is no freedom. So the concept of liberalization does not include cooperatives, because we are only looking at the liberalization on the screen, but it's just not about liberalization, it's about a lot of other things also. So our whole definition of life, our definition of progress, our definition of economy itself, it's guided by what is there on the screen. Now, one thing I just want to say, and which is going to strongly endorse what you said, Mini, right in the beginning, at the very beginning, in your very first opening comments, and that is that the aspect of education. But in what context? You said somewhere in the middle that we should look at merit. Of course, we should look at merit. It's important. We should look at some of the other values, free competition, opportunity, etc. But if in your 5 lakh villages, children do not have a possibility to take education beyond 7th standard, what merit are you talking about?
Opportunity.
No, but I mean, exactly, and what opportunity you are talking about? Unless you create opportunity,
No, just because we're being signaled that our session is already over time. I mean, I think I'll just say one last thing, that of course we've got to aspire and we've got to improve this country, but let's not beat up on ourselves too much.